I know you can't say hello back, but as Maza said, my name is Allison Burke, and I'm the clinical case manager for the program for survivors of torture and severe trauma. And I know that everyone participating in this webinar most likely works with one vulnerable population or another. So during this webinar, I'm going to focus on approaching vulnerable populations with a strengths approach. I'm specifically addressing vulnerable populations because it sometimes comes more naturally to focus on what they need and what they're missing rather than the skills and resources that they already have. And since my title is clinical case manager, I also rely heavily on some therapeutic tools to help support my clients. And I'm going to go a little bit in depth into some of those tools. So first of all, before I confuse anyone, I want to clarify that the strengths-based approach and the strengths approach refer to the same thing. So I'll be using both terms interchangeably. And during the webinar, I'm going to explain the strengths approach and how it can be incorporated into case management. And I'm also going to give a brief history and background. I'm doing this because I think that it's important to have an understanding of past models and how they affect the work that we do and how they helped the profession evolve. I'm also going to look a little at the research and the strengths approach effectiveness. And last of all, I hope to give you all a few tools like I talked about earlier. So I'm just going to touch briefly on the work that I do. So that you have some idea of the background that I'm coming from and the clients that I serve. So I've been working for the program for survivors of torture and severe trauma for a little over 2 years. And PSTT is an interdisciplinary program, and we try to take a holistic approach. But the primary thing I want to focus on are my clients that I work with. So they, in order to be eligible for the program, they must meet the criteria of torture. So as it says on the slide, torture is defined as an act committed by a person acting under the color of law, specifically intended to inflict severe physical and mental pain or suffering, other than pain or suffering incidental to lawful sanctions upon another person within his custody or physical control. So basically, I work with clients who have fled persecution in their home countries, have been tortured, have been unsafe, or their safety was threatened at one time or another. And as a result, they're here as refugees, asylum seekers, and asylees. And that means that they often have difficulty accessing services, and especially accessing the services that are government funded because they don't qualify for very many of them. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time going through a very brief history of mental health treatment. First of all, I think it's important not to completely discount the work that was done in the past, because we build off of that knowledge, and we wouldn't be here with the profession without all of that background. There were significant advancements made in the age of pathology, so I don't want to focus on just all of the bad things that happened during that time. And it's important that we don't use diagnosis that came from that time to define the client, but we also should avoid making diagnoses, and we should make sure that we help focus on the client and their strengths while they engage in treatment. And I'm going to talk much, much more about that when we get more into the strengths-based perspective and what it is. So in the 1700s, mental illness was primarily treated in asylums and monasteries. And an interesting point to make is asylums were never meant to be what they became known for. They never meant to be these awful places where you would lock people up. The word asylum kind of comes from the same word where we get asylum seekers and asylees, where they were seeking safety. It was seen, they were hoping that it would be a place that was a calming place where people could get rest and heal away from urban chaos. Obviously, that's not what happened. And back then, sin and moral failings were believed to be the cause of mental illness, poverty, substance abuse, any shortfallings. And common treatments included bloodletting and physical restraints. So not only did we not have an understanding of basic medical care, but we also weren't treating people like people. So in the 1800s, the emphasis on a sin's role in personal struggles was still the focus and how we understood mental illness. And there was a very paternalistic approach to treatment, but at that point, patients were treated like children, but it was a step up from being put in restraints and treated like animals. So in the 1900s, social services adopted the empirical method, helping to further legitimize the field, and that's a lot of what the knowledge we're basing off of what we do now comes from that empirical method. It also created a stronger focus, though, on genetics' role and environment's role in explaining personal struggles and diagnoses. And then in the 1930s, we had the explosion of psychoanalytic theory, and that became the lens that we viewed everything else through. We understood everything through the diagnosis and through the label we put it on, and the focus was on having that diagnosis so you could begin therapy. In 1958, we get the first inkling of the strengths model, where social work began to focus on helping individuals reach their maximum potential. And then in the 1980s, the focus of mental health treatment shifted to problem solving. So it was no longer about the diagnosis, but still the focus was on the problem rather than the strengths. And it was, again, believed that you had to have a name for the problem. You had to diagnose, you had to label what was wrong so that you could remove what was wrong and you could begin treatment. And then in 1989, we finally get the strengths perspective. And I dropped in that it came from the University of Kansas, and that's also where I got my MSW. So that was emphasized very heavily in my education. So as you can see from that brief history, we're in the midst of a paradigm shift right now. We're changing from asking what is the problem and how can it be fixed to what are the existing strengths and how can they be further developed. So we're no longer looking quite as closely at the diagnosis and the disease, but we're looking more at the potential. So taking a pathological or a problem-focused approach creates vulnerabilities to treatment that sometimes lead to multiple problems. People and systems with good intentions have unintentionally oppressed people for hundreds of years, and like I said with the asylums, it was meant to be a very positive place with positive experiences. In many of these systems, the professionals decided what was best for the client, sometimes without having a complete picture of what the client was going through. Also, focusing on deficits and what isn't possible can kill hope for the client and also for the case manager working with them. So think about that with your own life and how it's so much easier to find motivation if you're thinking about what you are capable of and where you might be able to go with your life than all the setbacks you've had and the possible failures and just catastrophizing and thinking about all those what ifs. So also victim blaming was a problem with the pathological approach because it can result from focusing on the diagnosis. For example, something you might hear is kind of in the framing of, oh, of course that happened, he's schizophrenic, when instead you could externalize that and say, let's see how the schizophrenia affects him and his actions and how he views the world. So that's hopefully something that we're shifting in the strengths-based perspective. Also, a while back there was the damage model, which was created and really pointed out dysfunction and any other mental illness in your family as a toxic agent. And it was viewed as like a disease, so you needed to have that removed in order so that you could be healthy. But as a result, people's support systems were removed, and they weren't really given a chance or the tools they needed to become supportive elements in that person's life. And last of all, there's a lot of systems that may not cater to the individual care, the individual needs. So like with some systems, you have to work from the level of most care to the level of least care, and you have to go through all the steps in between. And not everyone will need that for recovery or for their future wellness. Some people can skip steps. Some people might need to be in one step twice. But based on our current system of continuum of care, people can't really do that. So we've been talking about it a lot, but what is the strengths approach? First of all, it focuses on the client's strengths and the potential at all stages of case management. It is also client-centered, goal-oriented, recovery-focused, and solution-focused. And the philosophy behind it is very simple, and that's just that it's better to focus on the client's strengths rather than their weaknesses, which seems very obvious, and we'll go more in depth about the details of this. In the strengths-based approach, you build on the resilience and the potential for growth and development inherent in each individual. And I know that's a lot easier said than done, but I'll go into more tools and practical information. And I know a lot of you are probably thinking, well, that's nice to think about, but what about this situation? Now, I'm going to go a little bit into some of those situations later. Many different models can be considered strengths-based since it's more of a philosophy or a frame of reference than a formula of care. And those include models such as narrative, solution-focused, motivational interviewing, recovery-oriented, and I'm going to go much more in depth into recovery-oriented in a little bit. So the strengths that we're identifying aren't just the client strengths, but they can also be found in the community or in the environment. They can be developed as a response to the environment, or they can be resources available in that environment. So principles of the strengths model, and these help to really guide your care and your practice with your clients. So everyone has the ability to recover, reclaim, and transform their lives, and that is fundamental that you believe that. Not everyone can completely get to where they want or where they think they want to go, but we can at least help them live more of the life that they want. Also, the focus is on individual strengths rather than deficits. We already went over that. And focus on the strengths and available resources in the community. And that also means for us not getting bombarded with problems or deficits in the system. The client directs their care, so that means it's not our job to tell them what we think is best or to protect them from the world, but really believing that they're the expert of their own lives and what is best for them. And also they're the ones with the complete picture. We don't always know everything that's going on behind the scenes. So the relationship between the mental health professional and the client is an essential part of the client's improvement, and there are other studies that just show that rapport is very, very important for the client's outcomes. And it's important to meet the client where they are, both physically and mentally. So that means going out into the community when it's possible. I know in some agencies it's not, but it also means that you meet them where they are with their goals. It's a process, so don't skip any steps and create a realistic path to recovery or wellness. And characteristics of a recovery-oriented approach. I'm not going to go over every single one of these because there's a lot of repeats from the principles of the strengths model. However, the ones I really like are failure is viewed as a part of growth, because I think that's so important. Of course, our clients are going to fail from time to time. Of course, we as people are going to fail from time to time. But that's not an end state. That's something that you can learn from, and you continue from there still pursuing your goals. Another one I really like is peer support and self-help is encouraged and valued. So it's not that they have to only come to us with their problems or to come to us when they need help. They're encouraged to try and figure things out for themselves when possible, but also utilize peer support that they already have. So using one of those strengths that already exists to get further along. And then last of all, and probably the most unexpected in a strengths-based approach, is the staff anticipates crisis and creates a plan to address crisis with clients. We know that the world isn't perfect and the recovery isn't going to be one smooth transition, and there's going to probably be setbacks. So it's good to plan for that, know what to expect, know what those next steps are, and know what everyone's role is in that. And that's something you really need to get the client involved in on too, so that they can say what they want if there is a crisis. So the benefits of a strengths-based approach, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on some of these a little later on, but first of all, it creates and nurtures hope. And like I talked about earlier, just creating hope, feeling like you are capable of doing things rather than being reminded of all of your past failures is huge for motivation. It also fosters empowerment. It creates improved well-being and confidence in one's own abilities. It creates better rapport with the case manager, which again, talked about. And preliminary studies indicate that it may improve client outcomes. So I don't want to focus too much on the research because it's still relatively new. It was created in the 80s, so we haven't had that much data to work with. And more research is definitely needed so that we can really come up with definite conclusions. But the studies that there have been very hopeful, and it's shown when the strengths-based approach was used, there were decreased crisis center contacts, fewer hospital visits, improved community living and daily living skills, increased number of goals set as well as goals achieved, improved income stability, fewer reported problems with mood and thinking, and decreased reports of family burden from supportive people in the client's life. So I want to focus a little bit more on the factors that have been more studied and have been shown to affect outcomes. The therapeutic alliance and the mobilization of hope are both key parts of the strengths-based approach. And also, as you can see, they're also very impactful aspects of what psychotherapy is. And also, I think that can probably be transferred to what case management is, especially when you're working with a vulnerable population. So some common misconceptions, and I really think this is one of the most important things I'm going to address today, is that, you know, if you're taking a strengths-based approach, you're ignorant, you're not taking into account the real situation, you're overly positive, and that's just not the case. You can be strengths-based, but not strengths only. It's not our role to ignore or minimize anything that the client's struggling with. It's not our role when they turn to us or express what they need help with to say, oh, but look at all these great things you're doing and that you have done. You can do that in a way, but not in a way that minimizes or demeans any of the client's struggles or their emotions. It's also not our role to see only the positive aspects of a client's life. It's good for us to see the whole picture. It would be so awful if someone was living in a horribly abusive situation to flip around and only point out the positive aspects without trying to help them acknowledge the negative aspects and help them change their situation. And it doesn't require ignorance. You can see the world as it is, you can see the goods and the bads, but for a very long time, mental health treatment didn't incorporate the strengths. So the importance now is that we do that we see the world as it is, but we really realize the resources that have always been available to people and are available now and that we can build off of. And there probably will be moments of failure and crisis in most people's lives, and those shouldn't be seen as an end point, but rather something we can learn from and we can address and move on. So some strengths-based tools that I use regularly are identifying strengths and reframing, nurturing hope, further establishing or creating coping skills, helping with decision-making support, teaching and modeling self-advocacy and clinical self-awareness. And I'm going to go over all of those in more depth. So, most importantly, identifying strengths. Most basic strengths assessments will get the answers to 3 very basic questions. So the first is, what is going well? The second is, what would you like to see improve and how? And the last is, how have you been successful and have you seen improvement in the past? So you don't need to ask it like that, but it's important to get the information from those 3 questions. So for helpful tips, it's important that you ask open-ended questions so that you don't accidentally lead or limit their answers. And be specific. There's 3 very broad questions, but it's good to get the answers for every aspect of their life. So what are their strengths at work, at home, with their family, with their friends, when they're out in the community? It's important to know all areas of their life like that. And incorporate what they've already told you. I know this is kind of taking an intake 101, but sometimes we get kind of overwhelmed with the moment, and it's good to remember what they've already talked and build off of, or what they've already said, and to build off of that. They've probably revealed some basic strengths when they've been talking to you, just in why they're there and sharing that very basic information. And also, when possible, it's good to write the same words that the client uses so that you're respecting their voice and their view of the problem and not trying to make it more complicated than it needs to be for them. So, and here's another question that I get a lot: what if they can't identify any strengths? And that does happen when clients are very depressed. It's not that they don't have strengths, it's just hard for them to get into that mind frame. So reframe the problem from focusing on the client deficits to focusing on the client's potential. So focus on that goal. Maybe they probably could identify a goal or something that they'd wanted, and then focusing on what they're doing well that's going to help them get there. Also, it might help to externalize the problem. So instead of using phrases like your depression is holding you back, ask, how has your depression been affecting you lately? And that seems like a small change, but it's helpful so that the person shifts from seeing it as I am depression to this is a struggle that I will overcome, that I can overcome. And then also, what have you observed? So if someone's in the office and if they're a survivor or in a vulnerable population, chances are they're resilient. They're facing problems and seeking help. They're taking a risk by sharing their problems with you, the case manager. They're being resourceful and creative with working with limited resources. And sometimes the solutions they found in the past were very creative and very resourceful, but weren't seen as being a strength. So it's important to kind of see that they are using their skills and maybe they can use them even better in the future for a better outcome. And then if they're still struggling, you can also identify someone who's been supportive in their life and see what they think that person would say about what their strengths are. So we can help nurture hope by helping the client solidify a positive identity. And we can do this by helping the client identify areas of their life that contribute to self-worth and a positive worldview. So for personal, how do they view themselves? Are they creative? Are they athletic, hardworking? Usually someone will be able to identify something in that area that they are or that they used to see themselves as. And then for family, friends, and coworkers, one of my clients identifies herself first and foremost as a good mother, and that's the most important thing to her that she could possibly be. And it also represents a goal that she has achieved and that she continues to achieve every day by being a good mother. So finding those things that people really take pride of, that they really value, and you might skim past it, she's a mother, but that is who she is. And then also, what groups do they belong to? Some of my clients are still politically active based on what they went through in their country of origin, and that's a big part of their positive worldview and their hope, because they're working with people to see a change in a world that has been less than fair in the past. So as far as previous successes go, it helps to reinforce what is possible in the future by reflecting on what they've already succeeded in the past and what steps it took to get there. So it can be a story that they tell, but that also can reflect potential for the future. And then lastly, we can help the client to further develop areas of pride by using mentoring relationships, and that's both the mentor and the mentee. Both can create hope, either in that someone sees potential in you and wants to help you get to a better place, or that you know something well enough that you can help teach someone else to do that. And then also increasing community involvement, finding ways that they can engage in things that interest them and build on their interest, experiences, and knowledge. So when my clients talk about their symptoms of PTSD, which is probably the most common symptoms that my clients experience, I ask if they're doing anything that helps, and I really can't think of a single time when somebody didn't have an answer to that. So I've heard things like praying, talking to friends, getting on Skype, taking a deep breath, looking at religious pictures, going for a walk, writing. There's so many answers to that have been really successful to people in the past and continue to be successful. And the people I'm working with are survivors, and most likely the people you're working with are survivors too. So they have some really good ideas for how to cope. So my job as a case manager is help them build on these skills to help them cope even better so that they can achieve those other goals. So in addition to their individualized coping skills, almost everyone can utilize their memories and sensations to help them find peace, at least momentarily. So next I'm going to talk a little bit more about using memory and body as a resource and a strength. So I use anchoring skills and anchoring techniques probably the most out of any other skill, especially when I'm first meeting with a client and they obviously are experiencing hyperarousal or they're being triggered by something. So for memory as a resource, you just have them remember a comforting person, a place, an activity, an animal, an object, or just an event, a positive memory, and describe it in detail. And then that ties into body as a resource. So what were they feeling in that time? What were they smelling? There's one client who likes to talk about time she spent at a friend's house, and they would make tea and she could hear the kettle boiling, and just go into lots and lots of detail and focus on that and all of these details of this good memory, instead of the trigger that's creating the hyperarousal. So for body as a resource, like I said, you can incorporate that into the memory, but you can also use that as a way to experience the world around you right now, and use that to focus on and kind of flood out the thoughts of the trauma. So what I'll ask clients is to sit in a position, sit in their chair, take 2 deep breaths, and then I'll move from their feet going up, but I'll ask, okay, how do your feet feel? Are the muscles stiff? How does the floor feel against them? Is it hot or is it cold? Are your shoes comfortable? And then just moving up, like, does the chair feel soft or is it hard? Do you feel warm or cool in this room? Is your sweatshirt soft? How about the armrest? Are they cold or hard? And how does that feel? And then we'll move to other senses, like what are you smelling? What are you hearing? And if there isn't enough stimulus in the room, we can even just bring in a smell like soap or something like that to focus on. And that's a really good first step to take for a lot of people, is just going through all those senses. And that's one that I also use a lot when people are about ready to go into asylum court, which is a huge trigger. So by doing that, they can focus on the present. They can be anchored here in the present and not in the past with that trauma memory. So an Oasis is an activity that requires concentration and attention and helps reduce hyperarousal and inner dialogue. And the reason it's called Oasis is because it creates a mental oasis for people with PTSD. So the specific activities that work vary from client to client. If it's an activity that comes like second nature, it won't be a good Oasis activity for them. It needs to be something that requires a little bit of concentration. And actually the one I've been seeing the most lately is adult coloring books as being successful for that. I don't know if you've seen those, but they're very, very detailed, and people kind of lose track of time with that. And those are the kind of activities we're looking for, is something that people feel relaxed and lose track of time with. Knitting's another great one. Some people do card games or car repair. And some people do gardening, but since that's not very complicated, usually that's not always a great one. So decision-making support, this is probably one of the hardest aspects of our job, and it's something that we will face over and over again. So it's hard not to jump in and save the client, especially if we think we see them heading for struggle or trouble. But it's really important to stay focused on self-determination, and that this is their life and their choice, and they have the best understanding of what the sequences are most of the time. So it's not our job to save them from the world, and if they feel like we will try to control the situation, then they will not engage in the dialogue, and we may never be able to have that conversation with them where we get to explain our concerns and the possible consequences, and where they can come back and explain maybe other resources to help them cope with those consequences, or why they're making the decision they are. So during this process, it's really important for the case manager to remember that failure and facing natural consequences might be a very valuable experience, and that we may not understand the consequences better than the client does. And like I said, this has happened multiple times where the client knows of a resource that reduces the consequences of the decision, and then it makes it a pretty good decision, but I wasn't aware of that. And also the client might be prioritizing differently and be okay with the natural consequences. So you can be supporting to the person and empathetic of their situation, even if you don't fully understand the decision that they're making. And so one recent example I have of this is I had a client who stopped taking her psychiatric medicine, and I noticed that this was a pattern. When things would get their worst, she would stop taking the medication, and then of course things would usually get even worse because her symptoms would get worse. So I asked her, do you feel better when you're taking the medication? And she said yes, and I explained that I was seeing this pattern, and I asked why she kept stopping the medications when things were going badly, or when she was having more struggles, and she tried to explain it's kind of a form of rebellion, she said. So I asked, who are you rebelling against? And her response was, God and the person who tortured me. And my next question was, who faces the consequences when you don't take your medication? And the answer was me and my family. So we had a very long conversation following that, but it turned out that this was a response to survivor's guilt, basically. And If we had just gone and I had done that instinctual thing of take your medicine, we wouldn't have had this dialogue. She wouldn't have opened up to me, and we wouldn't have gotten to the point where at least, even if she's not going to take all of her medication overnight, we're to the point where she's going to begin taking more and more. And I would much rather have those small steps to progress that last over time and that you can build off of than one giant step that isn't sustainable. So the other skill, and I'm sure everyone on this call uses this one, is to teach. So being that it's our ultimate goal to help them be self-sufficient, teaching is huge. It's one of the biggest things you can do. So I try to teach in every possible moment that I can, and also to help teach to help further their sense of self and their confidence. So for example, if a client needs to schedule an appointment but feels uncomfortable calling alone, I will call with them first, and I'll model how to do that call. Then I'll coach them through it. We'll have it on speaker sometimes. And eventually the goal is that they'll call without me. The ability to confidently make the phone call doesn't seem like a huge step, but for many people, it's the first step that they take to advocate for themselves. So for some clients, it's also helpful to break down the tasks and goals into specific skills so that they will need. So with a lot of my clients, they struggle with their memories. So it's really useful if we can make every task more approachable. And it's broken down into one step at a time. Instead of go to the grocery store, it's get on the bus, pay the driver, bring your list, go into the store, get your things, just break it down step by step, and that seems to help. An example that I have of really breaking this down was one of my clients. Her ultimate goal was to go to ESL classes, and she felt that not speaking English was holding her back from everything else, so it seemed like an impossible goal. So because she didn't speak English, she was terrified to take the bus because she thought if she got lost, she would never find her way home again. So we came up with a very detailed plan. She didn't have a cell phone, couldn't afford a cell phone, didn't speak English, and could only read Arabic, so we had her write out phrases, emergency phrases, on one side in English, on the other side in Arabic, so that she could point to it, and it would, if she was lost, and have a phrase that said, "I'm lost." Another phrase, "Can I borrow your phone?" And we also identified landmarks on her way to go to the class instead of signs because she couldn't read the signs. And then we also had a list of emergency phone numbers for her to call. So on that list were friends, family, the people she was living with. My number was on there. And while it would have been easier for someone to just drop her off, that wouldn't have created the sense of accomplishment that having her go by herself and feeling like she could go anywhere did. And eventually she felt so confident she ended up taking like an hour bus ride to work every day once she was able to find a job. Her English took off, and I really see that as being the first step towards her self-sufficiency and towards reaching her goals, was just taking that bus independently. So our role in the strengths-based care can also be complicated. It's important to be aware of transference and countertransference, or how the client may direct their emotions to you and how your past relationships and experiences might impact your perception of the client. It's also important to mean what you say, and this is especially important in strengths-based because it's important not to be overly positive or to deny struggles, and I'm going to reiterate that one over and over again. Being honest is a part of successfully building rapport and establishing that alliance with the client. If they feel like you're just going to turn everything into being overly confident or overly positive, they're not going to confide in you. So last of all, and probably the most difficult, at least for me, is to see ourselves with a strengths-based perspective. You know, as people in the helping profession, we should allow ourselves the same compassion that we extend to our clients, and we should also be using coping skills and making sure that we have what we need to be successful and to engage in self-care. So due to the nature of our work, we should also be aware of any vicarious trauma that we may be experiencing. And ultimately, it is important for you to get the support that you need so that you can support your clients. One study actually even suggested that by taking a strengths-based approach to this type of work, it was mostly done with nurses, but it decreases burnout and people found that their work was more fulfilling. And then with our clients and the work that we do, it's really important that we view recovery as a process and that we don't see any setbacks as a permanent state, but we see them as learning experiences. So for this part, I'm going to want people to type out some answers. First, I'm going to read through this, and then on the next slide, I'm going to have some questions. So Julia came to the U.S. after fleeing violence and torture related to her political involvement. In addition, her mother passed away about 1 month before her first appointment with the case manager. Julia reported that she feels easily overwhelmed, re-experiences traumatic events, has difficulty sleeping, and thinks too much about the loss of her mother. She initially stated that she has no desire to do anything but lay in bed. Julia reported that she has one good local friend, but that this friend will be moving soon. She also regularly talks with her family and friends who live in her country of origin over Skype. Julia becomes tearful when she remembers the trauma and is not able or interested in talking or thinking about her trauma history at this time. She also struggles with anxiety, racing heart, hyperarousal, and fear of losing control when she is around groups of people. She stated that she would like to return to the level of functioning that she was at before the trauma. She also reported that she would like to have a job and make more friends, although both these prospects create anxiety for her. So here are some questions that I ended up asking her, and I'm also going to go over how she responded. And it's the next slide I'm going to have some questions for you. So in the past, what did you enjoy? And she responded that she enjoyed reading, going for walks, talking with friends, and simple crafts. So what happens when you do one of those activities now? And she said, I'm afraid, my heart races, and I lose control of my thoughts. What do you enjoy or feel comforted by now? I enjoy nonviolent movies when I can afford them. Can you remember a time in the U.S. when you were happy? Yes, spending time with my friend, but she will move soon. How do you feel when you talk with loved ones over Skype? I like talking with them, but I miss them more once the call ends. So here's where I'd like a response. What else do you think it would be important to know? And if you type it in, I think that will work. All right, anyone? All right, I'm going to move on to the next page. I do have more questions for all of you, though. So hopefully I can get some more responses. And Maza, are you getting anybody messaging you?
I haven't had any messages.
Okay.
Yeah.
Come on, somebody step up. All right, so what are her strengths? No one?
I haven't received any messages.
Okay.
God.
I will probably just move to the next. If anyone has a question or a comment, though, as I move on to the next slide, please speak up. Or if you're having technical problems, I guess it would be harder to speak up, but try and get our attention. So for her strengths, she's obviously resilient, committed to pursuing goals. She has a pretty strong support system. She has the ability to make friends and maintain relationships even over long distances. So for potential goals and coping skills, I actually have all that here. So for goals, she stated that she wants to return to the level of functioning that she was at before the trauma, and that we started that goal by having her leave the house for a 5-minute walk every day. And that seems like such a small step, but that first step is often the hardest one. And then for some people, that actually might even be too much to leave the house for 5 minutes a day. So it's all about meeting them where they are and with their abilities where they're at now. And then we focused on slowly having her interact more and more with the community until she was able to attend an interview or a group activity with tolerable anxiety. So not that she wouldn't be anxious at all, but that she could tolerate it, and then in the future she won't have that same anxiety at all. So for her current coping skills, she's watching movies. She said that she actually falls asleep a lot to movies a lot, and that helps her relax. And then talking with her friends and family. So we added to that breathing and relaxation exercises. We did that anchoring technique with observing senses. And at first she could only do it in a guided way, and we had to move very quickly, or else her mind would wander and she would be triggered again. So instead of being that kind of quiet, slow, relaxing, that way of approaching it was, okay, think about your feet. Okay, is it cold on your hands? Think about what you're smelling. It was very quick. And then we also did a guided relaxation that she began to do independently, where she would tense her muscles and then relax, and also take deep breaths through this. And I'm sure there's lots of guiding videos of how to do that guided relaxation online. At first, she wasn't able to use the coping skill of thinking back to a positive memory, because when she thought back to her childhood home, she just thought about everything that she had lost, and that would make her very sad because there was too much focus on then and now when she thought about that. But there was a memory that I discovered later of her friend's house back in her country of origin, where she really just felt safe and calm and supported, and so that's the memory that she focuses on a lot. And before she's going to a job interview or going to be around a large group of people, that's the memory that she'll think of. Also, she was able to incorporate some crafts that she originally did in her country of origin that became an Oasis. So things like cross-stitching, knitting, and I've been incorporating those adult coloring books a lot for a lot of clients. They're really helpful. And I know that seems kind of silly, but they're very relaxing. And then finally, does anyone have any questions?
I haven't received any messages.
Okay.
No.
Wait just a little longer. That's my last slide, except for a bunch of references and resources if you are working with trauma survivors.
Okay, I have received a few questions here. Let me start reading them all.
Great.
Okay. How do you talk about confidentiality while you talk with vulnerable clients?
Confidentiality? Well, directly. I'm assuming you mean just at that first interaction when you're talking about it. Actually, I'm a little confused. Can you repeat that?
Yes, the person just said yes. How do you talk about confidentiality while you talk with vulnerable clients?
Well, I think confidentiality is a way that we're helping empower them. We don't share their information with anyone other than who they give us permission to, and I think that's really good for them to know. I wonder if there was a specific situation or a specific.
Okay, so person who just asked the question is asking for individuals who are scared to open up with people. So how would you talk about confidentiality with vulnerable clients who are scared to open up to people?
Mm-hmm. I think confidentiality is a great thing to talk about with that. I mean, we have to anyways, but for me it's been helpful when I'll have my packet we go through, and one of those main sections is explaining confidentiality. But a lot of people I work with are really concerned that, like, I'm going to talk to other people that they've heard come here from their country of origin and that there's going to be gossip. So to go over that and explain that this is one of the primary tenets of my profession, and I really believe that this is important, that I will not share any information about you that doesn't help you and without your permission. And open up that dialogue if they have any other concerns, and explain the purpose behind that. And even with the part of our confidentiality, the examples when we're required to break confidentiality, one of the things I commonly would go into, like especially with survivors of human trafficking, was that with harm to yourself, if they disclose that they've been cutting, and that seemed to be something I was seeing a lot, that's not something I'm going to call and report. That's something we'll probably have a conversation about, but I'm not there to call if it's not life-threatening. I'm there to help as much as possible and help them stay safe. Okay. I don't know if that answered your question.
I'll let you know if yeah, she says that's helpful.
Okay.
Okay, next question. How do you initiate these conversations?
And I know a lot of that depends on the kind of organization that you have. I usually incorporate a lot of this into our intake, and our intake packet I think is pretty standard, where it's background and just general background, where they came from, the kind of trauma they went through, which is definitely not a strengths-based approach, but within that you can also reflect more on, wow, you went through that, so what got you through that? And then reframe it, help them point out their strengths, and then you can also incorporate that when you're doing your typical goal setting too. Especially when I'm hearing of trauma histories, which does not seem like a time when strengths could come up at all. It's pretty natural to incorporate what got you through, and a lot of times I hear faith, God, family, commitment to justice, and these things that are really inspiring. And I think it will take a little while before you can do it kind of seamlessly, but as you're going through all of the required papers that you have to do now, just think of how you can incorporate some strengths questions into that, and not even add to the questions, but create more strengths-based answers.
Okay. Another question. How do you navigate some of the tools when you are working with an interpreter?
Yeah. I have my favorite interpreters. I think we all do. Um, with the ones that you're going over, like I'm gonna guess the primary question here is the one where you're like asking them to squeeze and release and think about what they're feeling. Those can be definitely more difficult with an interpreter. Um, but usually I'll call the interpreter in ahead of time, and usually I have an idea of when I'm going to be doing that, and I'll talk about what to expect, and they might even be able to help you learn a couple words that will help you go through it a little bit more seamlessly. Um, as far as the other things, I just think it's the same challenges we all have from working with interpreters, where how I've navigated those is just to meet with the interpreter before and try to debrief afterwards so that we can make sure we're on the same page with every single client, and also so that they know the words that we're going to be using so they can prepare for that. But if that doesn't answer your question, please follow up.
Okay. I'll let you know if that person says anything. Next question, you talked about doing crafts with clients. Are there any specific techniques you recommend while working with minors?
I haven't worked with that many minors. I've worked with a lot of teenagers, but I feel like that's a different category. What I'll do a lot with some of my younger clients is I've used a lot of those coloring, the adult coloring books, because those are very trendy right now too. So we'll just color while we talk. If they've had a really rough day or a rough week, it actually helps facilitate more conversation. And then also I think that my office becomes a safer place, that I'm not going to put them on the spot and take a bunch of notes while they talk. We can color.
So the person who asked is also saying if you could elaborate how you would work with teenagers, any specific techniques with teenagers.
And this, I guess, what aspect of working with a teenager? With the crafts or?
Yes, with the crafts.
Okay. All of that's so individualized. It really depends on what their interest is. I have one client who really likes crocheting, so we've kind of learned how to crochet together, and that's been a really great experience because there are times when I'm teaching her, there are times that she's teaching me, and it's nothing that we do every week, but I'd say like once every 2 months we might incorporate that into our session, and then she'll bring in what she's worked on and show me. I don't think you can really have some project already figured out as far as the Oasis goes. I know there are some great craft projects that are more therapeutic oriented, and this is really just for that individual. So I guess my advice is see what they're interested in, and maybe that can be something that you use to get them excited too.
Okay, here's another question. For those who are not providing clinical services but more day-to-day case management, as in housing, employment, accessing healthcare, social services to vulnerable populations, can you give some advice on how to apply the same strengths-based approach to everyday barriers to self-sufficiency?
Yeah. That's incredibly hard, and I know you probably wanted more out of this, and as far as just case management. As far as I've found, it's more affected the way I look at the work than the way I work with the client, in that if there's a huge gap in resources, it means I'm going to reach out and try and find a church or an organization who might donate or something like that, or I'm going to try and meet with shelters so that I can find out how I can better refer clients. It doesn't change that there are huge barriers. It doesn't make those systems better, but it helps me keep working, and it helps me find some solutions. As you know, the person who asked the question, you know it's long going, but I think we also need kind of those hopeful, positive experiences to grab onto. And when we're pursuing solutions, we'll see a lot of failure, we'll see a lot of setbacks, but we'll also see occasional partnerships or donations or something like that that can really help the work that we do.
I don't see any more questions. I guess we can give it a few minutes and then.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, I don't see any other questions, so I guess we will finish. We'll wrap up. So, Allison, thank you so much for having this presentation.
You're welcome.
I'm sure we all got a lot out of it, so we appreciate that. I will be sending out slides from this presentation out to everyone. So, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
All right. Thank you again.
No problem. Bye.
Bye.